He was just a quiet mechanic in a small town living a simple life until a silent, hungry teen started showing up at his garage every day. No words were exchanged, just a sandwich, and something unspoken that passed between them. Years later, on the mechanic's wedding day, something happened that left the entire town speechless. If stories about kindness, healing, and the quiet ways we change each other's lives move, your heart makes sure to subscribe and join us for more unforgettable journeys like this one. Now let's begin. A mechanic gave a quiet teen food for years on his wedding day. 12 uniformed officers saluted him. The storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds swallowing the Wyoming sky like a slow-moving wave. Wind howled through the pine trees behind the garage, rattling the tin roof and sending dried leaves skittering across the lot like tiny dancers fleeing a stage. Dan Foster stood under the open bay door of his garage, wiping his oil-stained hands on a rag that had seen better years. The last customer's truck had just rumbled off down the gravel road, its tailpipe coughing in protest. Dan sighed, then leaned against the rusted frame of the doorway, staring into the swirling clouds. Something about days like this brought a heavy silence with him, the kind that didn't just fill the air, it settled in your bones. He glanced at the clock above the tool cabinet. 12:07 p.m., like clockwork. He turned his gaze to the corner of the lot near the old elm tree that grew beside the back fence, and sure enough, there he was. The kid was there. Same oversized hoodie, same worn-out sneakers, same quiet eyes that didn't meet his. He hovered near the edge of the property, half shielded behind the tree, pretending not to be waiting, though he always came at the same time. Rain threatened overhead, but the boy didn't flinch. Dan moved back inside and reached for the small red cooler he kept behind the counter. Inside, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a bottle of water, and an apple sat neatly packed. He'd made it this morning just like he had every morning for the past 3 months. He walked outside slowly, not wanting to spook the boy, and set the cooler on the wooden bench beside the garage. Then, without a word, he returned to his station inside. From the corner of his eye, he watched. The boy waited 10 seconds, maybe more, then emerged from behind the tree like a deer testing the wind. He glanced around, then crossed the yard in quick, silent strides, grabbed the cooler, and disappeared again just as quickly, fading behind the elm. Dan didn't know his name. The boy never spoke, but he came every day, and Dan didn't stop him. It started one afternoon 3 months ago when Dan caught the kid rummaging through his trash. The boy had been thin eyes, hollow and jumpy, like a stray cat, his fingers clutching a half-eaten burrito someone had thrown away. Dan could have chased him off, would have, but he didn't. Instead, he brought out a warm sandwich and offered it silently, standing 6 feet back. The boy took it and vanished. The next day he returned, so Dan kept packing an extra lunch and never asked questions. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled like an old dog waking up. Dan turned back to his workbench and grabbed the carburetor he was cleaning. The clink of metal and the familiar scent of grease grounded him comfort in repetition, in usefulness. He'd been running this garage for nearly 15 years since he left the Army. Didn't have family left. Didn't mind the quiet. But lately the quiet had felt different. Not peaceful. Lonely. He didn't know why he cared about the kid. Maybe it was the way the boy tried so hard to disappear, or the way he always looked back over his shoulder as if running from something that never let up. Dan knew that look. He'd worn it once. Just as he was tightening a bolt, a loud crack of thunder snapped the sky open, and with it a sudden downpour. He rushed to the doorway to close the garage bay, but something in the corner of his eye stopped him. The kid was still there, only this time he wasn't moving. He stood just beyond the tree line, soaked through the red cooler still clutched in both hands, as if unsure what to do with it now that the storm had broken loose. His eyes were fixed on something behind Dan, and then just like that he collapsed. Dan's heart skipped. The wrench hit the floor with a clang. He bolted across the lot, rain drenching him in seconds. "Hey," he called out, dropping to his knees beside the boy. "Kid, hey, you with me?" The boy was breathing, but barely. His face was pale lips, tinged blue. Dan shook his shoulder gently, then more firmly. "Come on, don't do this." No response. Dan didn't think. He scooped the boy up surprisingly light and rushed him inside. He laid him down on the cot in the break room, yanked open the emergency first aid kit, and grabbed a blanket. The kid was freezing, Dan knelt beside him, drying his hair with a towel, then checked for signs of injury. That's when he saw the bruises, purple-yellow, old and new, all down his arms and ribs. Dan swallowed hard. He knew those patterns, knew what caused them. Someone had been using this boy like a punching bag. Jesus, kid. The boy stirred. His eyelids fluttered open for a moment. Dan leaned in. You're safe here, he said low and firm. Nobody's going to hurt you. The kid blinked at him, dazed, but for a second Dan swore he saw something flicker in those tired eyes. Something that looked a lot like trust. Then the boy passed out again. Dan sat there in silence, the storm raging outside. The garage darkened. The world hushed. And for the first time in years, Dan felt something stir in his chest. Not pity, not duty, hope. That night, Dan didn't close the shop early. He stayed beside the boy, watching over him as if guarding something fragile and sacred. Outside, the rain poured without mercy, but inside that little garage, kindness had just cracked open a door that would never close again. By the time the boy stirred again, the rain had passed, leaving behind the crisp scent of wet pine and earth. Morning sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of the garage's break room, casting long beams across the concrete floor. Dan had dozed off in the armchair by the cot, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to one side. He woke to the sound of a soft shuffle, the boy trying to sit up. Dan was on his feet in an instant, careful not to startle him. Easy, he said, voice low, calm. You passed out yesterday, probably from cold or maybe hunger. I don't know. The boy blinked, then slowly lowered himself back down onto the cot. He looked toward the door, then at the sandwich still resting on the side table. Finally, his eyes met Dan's, just for a heartbeat. Dan noticed it again, what he'd seen yesterday before the boy slipped into unconsciousness. Beneath the guarded expression and bruises, there was something else, a flicker of gratitude. Or maybe relief. I'm Dan, he said simply, drying his hands with a rag. This is my place. The boy said nothing. That cooler back there, I've been putting lunch in it every day for a while now. Figured you might need it. Still nothing. Dan crouched near the cot, not too close. You don't have to talk. You don't owe me anything. I just want you to know you're safe here. And when you're ready to leave, no one's going to stop you. The boy studied him for a moment. Then he nodded, slow, careful. Dan handed him a fresh water bottle. The boy took it with both hands, his fingers trembling. Dan stood and let him be. He returned to his workbench, started tinkering with a busted fuel pump. Every few minutes, he glanced through the open break room door, making sure the boy hadn't vanished like mist. But he stayed finishing the sandwich, sipping the water like it was a luxury. By noon, the boy had gone quietly the way he always came. Dan didn't see him leave. Just noticed the cot was empty, the water bottle gone, and the cooler sitting on the table wiped clean. Dan smiled to himself and went back to work. The pattern resumed like clockwork. Every day at 12:07, the boy would return not to the cot, but to the edge of the garage lot where the wooden bench sat in the sun. Dan would set out a cooler with food. The boy would wait for Dan to turn away, then take it and disappear behind the elm tree. No words, no names, just consistency. Dan didn't push. He knew better than most that healing didn't respond to pressure. It responded to presence, predictability. Small acts that said you're worth showing up for. And that's what Dan did every day. One Tuesday afternoon, about a month after the boy first collapsed in the storm, a silver SUV rolled into the lot with a flat tire and a cloud of bad luck. Dan stepped out to greet the driver, wiping his hands on a rag. The woman behind the wheel looked flustered, tapping furiously on her phone. Stupid rental. I told them the tread looked low, she muttered. Dan gave a quiet chuckle. You're not the first. She looked up. Her frustration softened when she met his eyes. I'm Grace. Grace Monroe, she said, offering a hand. Dan Foster, he replied, shaking it. Grace stepped out, dusting off her slacks. She wore business casual with hiking boots, a woman caught between worlds. I just started working with the local youth outreach office. Still getting my bearings around this town. Well, Dan said, kneeling to inspect the tire, you found the only guy in town who'll fix this with one hand and a cup of coffee. She smiled, genuine this time. Sounds like a dying art. Dan shrugged. Around here, good coffee's the hard part. As he worked, Grace looked around, taking in the modest garage, the quiet road, the worn bench by the tree. You get many customers out here. Enough to keep me busy, Dan said. Not so many, I forget faces. Grace's eyes lingered on the red cooler sitting alone on the bench. That for you? No, Dan said quietly, not looking up. It's for a friend. Grace nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. Later that week, she returned not for her car, but to bring Dan coffee and a thank you cinnamon roll from the cafe down the street. He accepted it with a grunt and a half smile. They talked a little more each time she came. She asked about the town, the people. Dan offered directions, names a few stories. When she asked if he'd always been a mechanic, he hesitated, then said simply, used to be military. Afghanistan. After I came home, I needed something to fix that didn't scream at night. Grace didn't pry. She just listened. That too was a kind of kindness. Over time, Dan told her a little about the boy. Not much, just that he came around, needed food, never spoke. Grace's face grew still. There are a lot like him, she said softly. Kids who slip through cracks no one even sees. You did a good thing feeding him. Dan looked away. Didn't do much. Grace touched his arm. You did enough. One evening, long after Grace had left, Dan sat on the bench with a new cooler waiting. He didn't know why he stayed out that night, maybe to see the boy up close again. Maybe just to offer more than food. When the boy finally emerged from behind the tree, Dan didn't move. He just said, I was about your age when my dad walked out. The boy stopped in his tracks. Didn't leave a note. Just his boots in the mudroom. Took me years to stop blaming myself. A long silence. Then the boy took a step closer. I didn't do anything to deserve it either, Dan added. But I still thought I did. The boy set the cooler down slowly. Then for the first time, he spoke, his voice gravelly from disuse. My name's Eli. Dan looked up, nodding once. Nice to meet you, Eli. And then Eli disappeared again as quickly as he came. But the next day, Dan made 2 sandwiches, just in case. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the wind never seemed to settle, and the clouds loomed heavy with something more than rain. Dan had a feeling deep in his gut, the kind that never announced itself outright, but curled quietly in the chest like smoke before fire. Eli hadn't come by for 2 days. Not that Dan was keeping score, but he was. It was impossible not to. After nearly 4 months of showing up like clockwork, Eli's absence felt louder than thunder. The bench outside the garage remained empty, the cooler untouched. The second sandwich Dan had packed now sat stale in the fridge. He hadn't thrown it out. Couldn't. Dan wiped his hands on a rag and looked toward the elm tree. Nothing but the sway of wet branches and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. He told himself not to worry. Eli had gone quiet before weeks ago after that first storm, but something felt different this time. Then the screaming started. At first, Dan thought it was the wind again until it wasn't. A guttural, angry shout carried over from the side street that ran past the alley behind the shop. Dan froze. The voice wasn't Eli's, but it was familiar in a way that made his back straighten and his fist clench instinctively. He dropped the wrench and walked around the side of the building. What he saw made every muscle in his body tighten. A man in a torn denim jacket was grabbing Eli by the arm hard. The boy was struggling silently like someone who'd learned long ago that shouting did no good. His hood was down, exposing a bruise on his temple that hadn't been there last week. The man, tall, thick around the waist with a face mottled by anger and old booze, shook him hard. You think you can run off and eat from some damn stranger's hand like a stray mutt? You're mine, you little let him go, Dan said sharply, stepping forward. The man turned surprised but didn't release his grip. Who the hell are you? Dan didn't blink. Someone who's not about to stand here while you lay another hand on that kid. Eli's eyes darted to Dan, wide startled, a glimmer of something desperate behind them. Dan saw it. He stepped closer. I said let him go. He repeated, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that came not from volume but conviction. The man's lip curled. This is my boy. Ain't none of your business. Dan's voice dropped. It became my business when he started showing up bruised and starving. The man let out a bitter laugh. You one of those bleeding heart types, you think you're saving him. He's my blood, no, Dan said. He's a child. For a long beat, the 2 men stared at each other. Then, without warning, the man shoved Eli hard into the side of the dumpster. The boy collapsed, grunting softly. And that's when Dan moved. He didn't throw a punch, though part of him wanted to. Instead, he stepped between the man and Eli and planted his feet. Get out, he said. Before I call the sheriff. You think anyone's going to care about a piece of street trash like him? Dan's voice stayed steady. They'll care that you laid hands on him in front of a witness. The man hesitated. There was something in Dan's eyes, something cold and steady that didn't come from bravado. It came from experience, from war, from years of knowing exactly how much force to use and how much to hold back. Finally, the man spat at the ground and stalked off, cursing under his breath. Dan didn't watch him go. He was already kneeling beside Eli. "You all right, kid?" Eli sat up slowly, wiping at his bleeding lip with the back of his hand. His voice was thin, barely audible. "That was my dad." Dan didn't respond right away. He helped Eli to his feet, one arm steadying the boy's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you inside." Back in the break room, Dan cleaned the cut on Eli's lip and handed him a clean t-shirt from the supply closet. The boy changed in silence, folding his torn hoodie into a neat square and setting it on the table. Dan poured 2 cups of cocoa from the old thermos he kept for cold days like this. Eli held his with both hands, staring into the steam, as if it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. "That man, your legal guardian?" Dan asked. Eli didn't answer. "Does he live with you?" The boy shook his head. "Sometimes, when he gets evicted or loses another job, he just shows up." Dan nodded. "You got anyone else?" Eli looked down. "My mom died 2 years ago. It's just me." Dan leaned back in his chair. The silence stretched between them like a thread, fragile but unbroken. "You want me to call someone?" Dan asked. Eli shook his head quickly. "No cops. Please." "Why not?" "He'll find out. He always finds out." Dan exhaled slowly. He wanted to argue, wanted to march straight down to the sheriff's office and report the bastard. But the fear in Eli's eyes told him that the system had already failed this boy more than once. That trust for Eli came in spoonfuls, not buckets. So Dan made a choice. "Then you stay here," he said. "As long as you need. You don't have to talk. You don't have to explain. Just don't disappear again." Eli's grip tightened around the mug. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why do you care?" Dan hesitated. "Because someone should have cared about me when I was your age, and didn't." Eli looked up, his expression unreadable. But he didn't argue. That night, Dan pulled out the old cot again, laid down fresh blankets, and made up a second sandwich for the morning. Outside, the wind had calmed. Inside, something else had begun. Something small and fragile, but real. And for the first time in a long time, Dan didn't feel like the only soul in the world waiting for morning. The mornings came quietly after that, less like dawn and more like a slow exhale. For 3 days, Eli stayed in the back room of the garage, sleeping on the cot beside the dusty shelf of repair manuals, eating the meals Dan left on the small folding table. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Dan checked on him the way one checks on a campfire that almost went out, gently, respectfully, with just enough distance to let it burn on its own. Then one morning, Eli was gone. No note, no sound of footsteps. Just the folded cot, the t-shirt Dan had given him neatly laid on top, and the small red cooler sitting quietly in its usual spot on the bench. Empty, clean, the lid closed as if to say, "Thank you." Dan stood for a long time beside the bench, staring at the empty space beneath the elm tree. He didn't panic, not immediately. He knew Eli had a habit of vanishing, of slipping between the cracks without a trace. But this time felt different. After what had happened with Eli's father, Dan had hoped the boy might stay longer, might believe that the garage was more than just a safe place to sleep, might believe he was wanted. Dan packed a cooler anyway. Grace stopped by that afternoon, holding 2 coffees and a paper bag from the bakery. "I brought cinnamon twists," she said, her smile gentle. "Your bribe for a free tire rotation." Dan managed a small grin. "Depends how fresh they are." She stepped inside and set the bag on his desk. "I haven't seen the boy the last few times I came. He okay?" Dan's expression tightened. "He was here for a few nights. Then he left. Didn't say where." Grace sat on the stool across from him. "He's not the type to say goodbye, is he?" "No," Dan said. "He's the type to expect people to leave, so he beats them to it." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I've met a lot of kids like that. In the system. They don't trust easily. And when they finally start to, they scare themselves and run." Dan didn't reply. Grace leaned forward. "But you got through to him, Dan. Don't downplay that. He shrugged. I just gave him food. A place to crash. That's not exactly a hero story. Don't sell kindness short, Grace said. Sometimes it's the first brick in a bridge they didn't think existed. She looked around the garage, then at the cooler by the bench. You still packing his lunch? Dan nodded. Every day. Grace's smile softened. Then he's not really gone. Not if you're still showing up for him. The days turned into a quiet rhythm. The garage hummed with the usual business break jobs. Oil changes, cracked radiators. Dan worked with quiet focus, but something was missing beneath the grease and gears. A stillness that used to be peace now felt like waiting. At night he sat at his kitchen table with the radio on, low, flipping through the newspaper without reading it. The cot stayed folded, but not put away. It felt wrong to store it, like closing a door that might still open again. Then one Friday afternoon he saw something that stopped him cold. On the back wall of the garage, where he usually tacked up invoices and service reminders, someone had pinned a small photograph. It was a snapshot, low resolution, clearly printed from a public library or a convenience store. The image showed the bench outside the garage, the red cooler on top with a note written across the bottom in thin black ink, I didn't forget. I'm just trying to deserve it. Dan stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his fingers. A warmth spread through his chest, not the heat of triumph, but something quieter, more profound, the feeling of being seen. He thumbtacked the photo back in place and stood back. Then he packed a second sandwich for tomorrow. The garage became something different after that. Not just a place for carburetors and timing belts, but a kind of quiet refuge. It started with a teenager named Lucas, who'd been kicked out of school and wandered into the garage looking for work. Dan didn't ask about his record, just showed him how to change an air filter and handed him a wrench. Then came Marisol, a girl from the edge of town who needed help fixing her bike, but stayed for an hour to watch Dan rebuild an alternator. She asked questions. Dan answered them. She came back the next day. Grace noticed. This could be something you know, she said one evening, bringing over flyers from a youth mentorship initiative she used to run in Denver. You've got the space, the skills, the heart. What if you turn this place into more than a business? Dan looked at her puzzled. You mean like teach kids how to fix cars? More than that, Grace said, eyes brightening. Teach them they matter, that they can build something with their own hands, maybe even rebuild themselves. Dan hesitated. I'm not a teacher. You don't have to be, she said. You just have to be what you already are. He looked out the window where Lucas was sweeping the shop floor and Marisol was laughing with a socket wrench in hand. The sun dipped low over the Pine Ridge, painting everything gold. And for the first time in a long time, Dan felt like maybe he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That night, Dan stood at the edge of the lot beside the elm tree. He held a small battered thermos in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He didn't expect to see Eli, but he spoke anyway into the trees. I don't know where you are, or what you're running toward, or away from, but you're not forgotten, not here. You were never just a stray Eli. You were a spark. He left the cooler on the bench, same as always, and inside it, tucked between the sandwich and the apple, he added a folded note. Whenever you're ready, this place is still yours. Then he turned off the light and walked back inside, not waiting, just hoping, just believing. Like he'd learned to do one small kindness at a time. The first warm breeze of spring swept across the Wyoming plains like a quiet promise. The snow had melted into memory, and for the first time in months, Dan left the garage bay doors open, letting the scent of pine and motor oil mix in the air. It had been nearly 8 weeks since he'd last seen Eli. 8 weeks of routine and uncertainty. 8 weeks of packing that extra sandwich and setting it out on the bench beneath the elm tree. 8 weeks of unanswered hope. But Dan never missed a day. He didn't tell Grace about the ache it left behind, how each untouched cooler sent a small ripple of disappointment through him. He didn't tell Lucas or Marisol or the other kids who'd begun trickling into the garage after school. He just kept showing up the way he always had. It was late in the afternoon when it happened. Dan was elbow deep in the undercarriage of a '97 Chevy that rattled like a wind chime in a thunderstorm. Marisol was handing him a wrench when the air shifted just enough for him to feel it in his chest. Someone was watching. He rolled out from beneath the truck and blinked against the sun, and there across the lot, standing beside the elm tree like he'd never left, was Eli. Older, taller, shoulders more squared, but still unmistakably him. Dan said nothing at first. He slowly stood, brushed off his hands, and looked at the young man now standing with his hands buried in the pockets of a worn gray hoodie. The same kind of hoodie he used to wear, but this one fit better. He looked healthier, stronger, but his eyes, they hadn't changed. Still carrying something deep, still cautious. Marisol looked from Dan to Eli and instinctively stepped back, sensing something personal unfolding. Eli didn't move. His gaze shifted to the cooler still sitting on the bench, then back to Dan. "I thought you might have stopped," he said finally, voice lower than before, but still gentle like someone afraid of breaking glass. Dan's throat tightened. "Didn't want to. I didn't deserve it." Dan crossed his arms. "Not your call." A long silence passed between them. Eli took a slow breath. "I went north, Montana, caught rides, worked odd jobs, got my GED. I even tried construction for a while." Dan nodded, not needing every detail, just glad to hear he'd stayed alive. Moving forward. "Why'd you come back?" he asked. Eli looked down, toeing the dirt with his shoe. "I heard about the garage, the kids." "What you're doing here?" Grace told me. Dan blinked. "You talked to Grace." "She came to a shelter I was volunteering at last week in Billings. I didn't tell her who I was, but she knew." Dan chuckled softly. "Yeah, she would." Eli stepped forward. I didn't come to stay. I just wanted to see it, to see you. And thank you for not giving up." Dan let the moment settle before he replied. "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do," Eli said, more firm now. "You saved my life. Not just the night my dad came before that. You saved me with a sandwich in silence, when no one else even saw me." Dan felt the emotion surge behind his ribs, tight and raw. He cleared his throat. "I saw you," he said quietly. "I still do." Eli looked around. "This place, it's more than it was." "Because of you," Dan said. Eli blinked. "What do you mean?" Dan gestured toward the workbench where Lucas and Marisol were laughing over a busted alternator. "I started this because of you. You were the first kid who made me realize I could offer more than an oil change." Eli swallowed hard. "I wanted to believe," Dan said, "that what I gave you mattered, that maybe it could matter for others too." For a long moment, Eli said nothing. Then he walked to the bench, lifted the cooler's lid, and looked inside. A sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, just like always. He smiled, small and grateful. "Same combo," he said. "Didn't want to mess with a classic," Dan replied. Eli nodded. Then he picked up the cooler, turned back to Dan, and walked forward until he stood a foot away. And then, without warning, he hugged him tight, sudden, like something he'd held in for too long. Dan stiffened for a second, then slowly, carefully wrapped his arms around him in return. No words, just a quiet, mutual understanding. The kind that doesn't need language to mean everything. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Grace joined Dan on the back steps of the garage. She'd heard from Marisol what happened and brought a thermos of warm cider to share. Dan sat with his elbows on his knees, silent but content. "You okay?" Grace asked. He nodded. "Yeah, just full." She smiled. "You look proud today." "I was," he admitted. "Still am." She handed him a folded piece of paper. "He left this with me when he got on the bus." Dan unfolded it. A simple handwritten note in Eli's careful script. "I'm not ready to stay yet, but I'm not running anymore. One day I'll be back. I want to build something. Like you." Beneath it was a sketch, crude but full of heart of the garage, with a hand-painted sign across the top, Foster & Sons. Dan stared at it a long time, then let out a shaky breath. Grace rested her head on his shoulder. "You gave him a name he could belong to," she said. Dan didn't answer. He just closed his eyes, let the evening breeze touch his face, and smiled into the fading light. Some people build legacies with money or fame. Dan Foster had built his with kindness, one sandwich at a time. The first thing Dan did was clean out the far corner of the garage. It wasn't much, just a cluttered section where old tires gathered dust and forgotten tools lay like relics of projects half finished. But under Dan's quiet determination, the space began to change. The clutter disappeared. Pegboards went up. A second workbench took shape. Grace brought in a few folding chairs from the community center. Lucas and Marisol helped paint the walls a warm shade of slate blue. It was small, modest, but it felt like a beginning. They didn't call it a program at first. Dan hated that word. It sounded too formal, too clinical. What they had was more like a circle, a safe orbit, where kids with nowhere else to go could learn how to use their hands and be seen for more than their mistakes. The first to return was Lucas. After school, he showed up wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big and sneakers with duct tape over the toes. He stood in the doorway like a kid pretending not to hope. Dan handed him a socket wrench without a word and gestured to the Ford F-150 up on the lift. Lucas grinned. "We doing brakes again?" Dan nodded. "We're doing patience." Then came Mia, who lived with her older sister in a trailer off Old Ridge Road. She'd heard from Marisol that the guy with the garage teaches stuff without asking too many questions. She had a hard stare, a nervous laugh, and a natural instinct for fixing things. She didn't talk much at first until Dan let her reassemble a carburetor without guidance. She got it right on the first try. "You got a sharp mind," Dan said. "Don't let anyone dull it down." Mia smirked. "You sound like my sister. She sounds smart." More kids came, one by one, slowly then steadily. Word spread not through flyers or outreach, but through whispers, one kid telling another, "He doesn't treat you like a screw-up. He treats you like someone worth teaching." By the third week, Dan had 6 regulars. One evening after the last of the teens had gone, Dan sat with Grace on the steps outside the garage, watching the golden light bleed through the pines. The sky was the color of old denim. Grace had a clipboard in her lap, full of notes and ideas. "You know," she said, tapping the top of the page, "we could apply for a grant. There's funding for youth vocational training, especially in rural counties like ours." Dan leaned back against the rail, a screwdriver twirling between his fingers. "That mean I'd have to give speeches?" "Not if you let me do the talking," she smiled. Dan chuckled. "Deal." Grace set the clipboard aside and looked at him. "You've created something here, Dan. Something bigger than I think you even realize." He shrugged. "I'm just teaching them how to fix things. You're teaching them how to believe they're not broken." Dan didn't say anything for a moment. "Then I think maybe I needed that too." Grace reached over and gently touched his hand. "We all do." They filed the paperwork together the next morning. Grace handled most of it, navigating forms, grant terms, and proposal language, with the focus of someone who'd once built nonprofits from nothing but kitchen tables and idealism. Dan offered the mission statement in 5 honest words. "Teach kids what I know." The funding wasn't immediate, but while they waited, others stepped in. Mr. Harlan, the retired shop teacher, donated a full set of woodworking tools. The diner down the street dropped off lunch trays twice a week for the kids, the owner grumbled, though her eyes misted when Lucas said thank you with a hug. A local parts store started offering discounts in exchange for a good story every now and then. Even the sheriff stopped by one afternoon not to lecture, but to offer help organizing a safety workshop. This place, he told Dan, is doing more to keep these kids out of trouble than a badge ever could. Dan nodded, humbled. "They're good kids, just need a place to belong." One Friday, while they were rebuilding a transmission, Lucas asked Dan a question that caught him off guard. "Did you ever want kids?" Dan paused, the ratchet still in his hand. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Once. Life had other plans." Lucas didn't pry, just nodded and tightened the next bolt. Later that evening, after the last kid left, Dan found a folded piece of paper on his desk. It was a note written in Lucas's uneven handwriting. "I don't have a dad, but if I did, I'd want him to be like you." Dan sat with the note in his hands for a long time, staring out at the sun setting behind the hills. He didn't cry, but his chest ached in the best kind of way. Spring melted into early summer. The garage buzzed with life now, tools, clinking music, playing, teenagers laughing as they wiped grease off their hands and learned how to listen to the hum of an engine like it was a heartbeat. Grace had moved into a small house a few blocks away. She came by every afternoon helping with grant updates and life skills workshops, resumes, interview prep, even budgeting classes. Dan began to wonder how he'd ever run this place without her. One night under the soft light of the break room, Dan took her hand. "I don't know what this is between us," he said, "but I know it's the best thing I've had in a long time." Grace smiled, her fingers lacing with his. It's something good, Dan. Something worth building. He nodded. Then let's build it. Together. On the far wall of the garage, just above the main workbench, Dan hung a framed photo. It was the snapshot Eli had left months ago, the bench, the cooler, and that handwritten line I didn't forget. I'm just trying to deserve it. Below it, Dan had mounted a small plaque, where kindness starts, miracles follow. He didn't know when Eli would return again, but this time he wasn't waiting in the quiet. He was building something. Something solid. Something real. And he knew deep down Eli would find his way back, because now there was something here worth coming home to. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. It was nestled between a parts invoice and a coupon booklet from the local feed store. Dan might have missed it altogether if it hadn't been for the handwriting, neat, deliberate, and strangely familiar. No return address, just his name, Dan Foster Foster's, Auto and Repair, Willow Creek, WY. He turned it over in his calloused hands. The paper was thick, textured, the kind sold in stationery aisles where people still wrote things that mattered. Inside, a single sheet folded in thirds. He stood at the workbench for a long moment, the morning light slanting across the grease-streaked floor, before finally opening it. Dear Dan, I don't know if you'll recognize my handwriting. I hope you do. I practiced it, wanted it to look like someone you'd be proud of. I've written and rewritten this letter about a dozen times. Each version felt too small, too flat, too clean to hold everything I want to say. But I guess the right words don't have to be fancy. They just have to be true. So here it is. Thank you for the food, for the silence, for the cooler on the bench, for never asking questions I wasn't ready to answer, for being there anyway. I was hungry, Dan, not just for food, but for safety, for peace, for someone to see me and not flinch. I never said anything back then because I didn't know how. I thought kindness was a trick. I thought it was something people used to get things from you. But you gave without asking. You fed me when I was invisible. You let me disappear and come back like it was normal. Like I mattered. You didn't just keep me alive. You taught me what being alive could mean. When I left the last time, I wanted to come back sooner. But I made a promise to myself I wouldn't return until I could look you in the eye and tell you I was building something good. Something that might even make you proud. I'm working now, nothing fancy, just honest work. I take night classes. I've even got a little apartment near the base. And on Saturdays, I volunteer at a youth center. I show up with sandwiches and never ask questions. Sound familiar? A few weeks ago, I was talking to a kid named Jordan, quiet, like I was always looking over his shoulder. I asked him what he wanted most in the world. He said, someone who doesn't give up on me. I told him I used to know a guy like that. A guy who gave me food every day and let me be invisible until I was ready to be seen. You were that guy, Dan. Still are. One day I'll come back, not as the kid you saved, but as the man your kindness helped build. I don't know when, but I will. Until then, I'll keep doing the one thing I learned from you. Better than anything else, I'll keep showing up. Eli. Dan didn't move for a long time. He reread the letter once, then again, the words etching themselves into a space inside him he didn't know still needed healing. Around him, the garage continued on in its usual rhythm, Marisol laughing from the back, Lucas arguing with Grace about which socket set belonged where. Life was happening. Life he had built. But for now it paused, as if the room itself was giving the letter its proper reverence. He folded it gently and placed it in the drawer where he kept things that mattered. Next to a photo of his mother, a medal from his army days, the hand-drawn sketch of Foster and Sons Eli had left behind. Then he stepped outside. The sky was clear and the wind was soft, no storms today. He walked to the bench beneath the elm tree where the cooler still sat, just like it always had. For a moment, Dan placed his hand on it, then looked out toward the horizon. He felt no ache today, only fullness. That night after the last kid left and the garage had quieted to its usual hum, Grace found him alone at the workbench, sipping from a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it slowly, her fingers trembling by the final paragraph. When she looked up, her eyes were misty. He wrote this to you, Dan, she said. But it's more than a thank you. It's a blueprint. Dan leaned back, arms folded. For what? For what love looks like when it's quiet, when it's steady, when it chooses to stay even when no one asks it to. He looked down at his hands scarred and stained with decades of grease and smiled faintly. I wasn't trying to be a hero. You weren't, Grace said. You were something better. You were kind. She reached out, took his hand in hers, and placed it over the letter on the table. And kindness doesn't go unnoticed, Dan. It plants seeds. And look around you. They're growing. Outside, a warm breeze danced through the pine trees, and somewhere in the fading light, a boy-turned-man was still showing up in every lesson, taught in every sandwich, packed in every bolt, tightened by a kid who once thought they were beyond fixing. Dan turned off the shop lights, locked the door, and walked out with Grace by his side. The stars were starting to bloom above them, silent and bright, just like everything Dan had done that nobody saw. And yet somehow it had lit up the world anyway. The first time Grace suggested they have the wedding at the garage, Dan laughed. Not the mocking kind, just a surprised, breathless sound, like he wasn't sure she was serious. You want to get married here, he asked, looking around the dusty floor and rows of mismatched toolboxes. Grace stood beside him with her arms crossed, surveying the space, as if imagining a cathedral. Why not, she said, smiling. This is where everything started. Where you started something good, something real. Dan looked at her soft curls tucked behind her ear, a grease smudge on her blouse from helping Mia reset a timing belt earlier, and for a moment he forgot all the reasons he used to think his life was too rough, too small for love like this. I don't know the first thing about throwing a wedding, he said. Grace grinned. Lucky for you, I've planned community fundraisers with $20 budgets and 150 guests. This'll be easy. And just like that, they were engaged. Not with fanfare or flashbulbs, but with clarity, laughter, and a moment so full of quiet joy that Dan felt like the luckiest man on the planet. The kids insisted on helping. Lucas offered to sand and repaint the old tool cabinets to match whatever color Grace wanted. Please not pink, he begged. Marisol appointed herself in charge of music, working on a playlist that swung wildly between Frank Sinatra and early 2000s pop. Mia began folding napkins into oddly shaped flowers, claiming it added elegance. The entire garage buzzed with anticipation. Even customers caught wind of it. Mrs. Harland, who came in every Thursday for tire checks she clearly didn't need, offered to bring homemade peach cobbler. The sheriff donated strings of lights from last year's town fair. Someone anonymously dropped off a bouquet order with the florist's sunflowers and white roses, exactly what Grace would have chosen. Dan was overwhelmed not by the fuss, but by the kindness of it all. It was as though the town had decided collectively to say, you gave us something. Let us give something back. One evening, about a week before the wedding, Dan stood alone in the garage. It was after hours. The shop was quiet. Only the amber glow of the hanging bulbs filled the space. He walked the perimeter, checking little details, the bench where Eli used to sit now, sanded and varnished to a soft sheen. The workbench cleared of clutter, ready to hold flowers and cake instead of oil pans and bolts. And at the center of it all, the place where he'd first taught Lucas to rotate tires, where Grace once spilled coffee while trying to learn torque specs, was a small wooden arch. It wasn't fancy, just something the kids had built from old lumber, wrapped in simple white cloth and twinkling lights. But it stood proud, solid, like everything they'd built here. Dan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a photo. The sketch Eli had once drawn, Foster and Sons, now folded and worn, but still treasured. He looked at it, smiled, then gently tucked it into a small wooden box beneath the arch. He didn't know whether Eli would show up for the ceremony, but somehow Dan felt like he'd be there one way or another. The morning of the wedding arrived with gold-streaked skies and the scent of summer hanging in the air. Grace's dress wasn't white. It was a soft cream with lace at the sleeves, something borrowed from her aunt's closet and tailored to fit by a neighbor. She wore her hair loosely pinned strands falling in waves. Dan, in his only suit, a dark navy number that still fit from his cousin's wedding a decade ago, stood by the garage door rubbing his palms together like he was prepping for engine work. Lucas and Mia flanked him, both beaming with pride. Marisol handed him a boutonniere. I made it myself, she said, tilting her head. It's got engine parts. Dan looked down. Sure enough, a small rust-free washer sat nestled among tiny white flowers and twine. Perfect, he said. The guests weren't many, just friends, kids, neighbors, and a few stray souls who had wandered into Dan's life over the years and stayed. But it was enough, more than enough. The music started a simple acoustic guitar version of Can't Help Falling in Love, and Grace stepped into the open doorway. Dan couldn't breathe. It wasn't just how she looked, it was the way she looked at him. Like she saw all of him, the grease-stained years, the heartbreak, the quiet loyalty, and loved him not despite it, but because of it. As she walked toward him, Dan's heart beat steady grounded. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. They met under the arch the kids had built, hands clasped, eyes locked. Grace's voice was steady as she said, "I used to think home was a place. Then I met you." Dan swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "You're the first person who made me want to build a future again, brick by brick, with both hands." The crowd cheered as they kissed, nothing theatrical, just a quiet, reverent kind of kiss, like a promise. As the sun began to set, the garage turned into a celebration. String lights flickered overhead. Music filled the air. Someone pulled Dan into a dance. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed that freely. Then the moment happened. Just as the evening reached its golden hour and Dan stepped outside for a breath, he saw them. 12 figures, lined up in front of the lot, wearing full uniform. Dan froze. Military, police, fire department, a mix of branches, ages, genders. Standing at attention, and at the center, Eli, older now, in full formal dress. Standing tall and proud, Dan walked slowly across the gravel, heart pounding. Eli stepped forward. No words, just a silent nod. Then in unison, all 12 lifted their hands and gave a solemn, formal salute. Dan stood still, emotion rising in waves. Eli finally spoke. "This is for you, Dan. For every lunch, every moment, every act of quiet faith. We're here because of you." Dan's eyes glistened. He whispered, "You came back." Eli smiled. "Told you I would." Then in front of friends, neighbors, and the love of his life, Dan Foster, grease-stained, gentle-hearted Dan, lifted his hand to return the salute. And for once, the whole world stood still just to say thank you. The morning after the wedding felt like waking from a beautiful dream and discovering that miraculously it was all still real. Dan stood by the window in the modest living room of his small home, still dressed in his undershirt and slacks, holding a mug of coffee he'd forgotten to sip. Outside, the sun climbed gently over the pines, casting golden light on the gravel drive, and the garage across the street, his garage. Their garage now. Grace stirred behind him, barefoot and wrapped in one of his old flannels, her hair loose and uncombed. She came to stand beside him, rested her head against his shoulder. "You're quiet," she said softly. Dan chuckled under his breath. "That's normal." She nudged him gently with her hip. "No, this kind of quiet is different. You're holding something in." He paused, searching for the right words. "Yesterday, I don't think I've ever felt anything like that in my life." Grace smiled. "You mean the wedding or the salute?" Dan's throat tightened. "Both." He turned to look at her. "He came back. Grace, he came back. And he brought an army with him." Grace leaned against the window frame, her eyes softening. 12 of them. Different uniforms, different paths. But the same story somewhere along the way. Eli helped them. And when they asked him how he knew how to help, Dan nodded, finishing the thought. He pointed to me. Grace reached for his hand. "Dan, that moment out there, it was bigger than just a thank you. It was legacy." He didn't answer right away. The word lingered in the air. Legacy. It had always sounded like something for other people, politicians, CEOs, heroes in parades. But now he realized maybe legacy was quieter. Maybe it looked like a red cooler on a bench, a cot in a break room, a wrench passed into the hands of a kid who needed someone to believe in them. Maybe it looked like 12 salutes under a Wyoming sunset. Later that afternoon, Dan walked over to the garage alone. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe a forgotten bouquet, a dropped tie, a smudge of cake frosting on the floor. Instead, what he found was a sealed manila envelope taped to the inside of the office door. His name was scrawled in block letters, Dan. He peeled it off gently and stepped inside. Grace joined him minutes later, having wandered over with a bowl of leftover fruit salad and 2 forks. "What's that?" she asked, setting the bowl down. Dan didn't answer immediately. He sat at the desk, opened the envelope, and unfolded the documents inside. A typed letter was clipped to the top. At the top of the page, Operation Wrench Foundation, in bold Navy letters, followed by a brief mission statement. He read aloud, voice slow, careful. Operation Wrench is a nonprofit initiative created by those whose lives were shaped by Dan Foster, a Wyoming mechanic who believed that one act of kindness could change a life and did. Grace leaned in. Is this from Eli? Dan said, scanning the rest. He started it under another name 3 years ago. Anonymous donations, small grants, support for youth mentorship programs across the Midwest. He held up a page, a list of towns, partner garages, community centers, all of them supported by something Eli had started in Dan's honor without ever using his name. Until now, there was more. A bank letter, a routing slip, a transfer receipt. Dan blinked. Grace, he said slowly, holding up the final sheet. They've been funding our garage's teaching program, quietly, for over a year. Grace gasped. What Dan nodded. Every time we got an anonymous parts donation or when the utilities got paid early, it was them, him, Eli. He sat back in the chair, the weight of it all sinking into his chest, not heavy but full, brimming. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the letter. Dan recognized the print right away. I didn't come back to say goodbye. I came back to hand the wrench off. You kept the engine running. Now let me help fuel the road ahead. Dan closed his eyes for a moment. He's not just thanking me anymore, he said. He's joining me. Grace came around the desk and placed her hands gently on his shoulders. You gave him roots, Dan, and now he's giving others wings. By the end of the week, Dan had framed the letter and hung it beside the photo Eli had once left the cooler on the bench and the words, I didn't forget. I'm just trying to deserve it. He added a third piece of photo from the wedding taken by a guest where Dan stood in front of the 12 uniformed men and women, hand raised in salute, Grace just behind him, smiling with quiet pride. The wall was no longer a collection of memories. It was a map. That Saturday, the kids returned like always. Lucas carrying a busted alternator, Mia in a grease-streaked hoodie, Marisol playing DJ from her phone. Grace waved a flyer at them as they came in. We've got something new, she said, beaming. Operation Wrench is official. Scholarships, apprenticeships, field trips to Denver tech schools. And guess what? She held up a clipboard with applications. You're all already on the list. The kids erupted into cheers and jokes. Lucas turned to Dan. You starting a franchise now or what? Dan smirked. Nah, I'm just keeping the door open. Then quietly, almost to himself, like someone once did for me. As the day wound down, Dan stepped outside and looked at the sunset bleeding across the sky. The breeze carried the scent of oil and pine and fresh-cut grass. Behind him, laughter echoed through the garage, the sound of young people building, trying, becoming. And Dan, a man who had once thought his life would end in the same quiet solitude it began, now stood in the golden light of something he hadn't dared imagine, a future he helped shape. He placed his hand on the door frame, the old wood warm beneath his palm. You're doing good, kid, he whispered to the wind. Then he went back inside to work, to teach, to keep showing up. For a man who once lived most of his life in silence, Dan Foster had never heard a silence quite like that moment. 12 figures stood at the edge of the gravel lot, still proud uniforms, gleaming beneath the soft amber light of sunset. Behind them, the town was hushed. Behind them, the world itself seemed to be holding its breath. Dan didn't move. His hands, strong from decades of wrenching bolts and replacing radiators, now trembled ever so slightly at his sides. His chest ached, not from pain, but from something so wide and deep it had no name. Grace stepped up beside him, gently touched his arm. They're here for you, she whispered. He nodded slowly, unable to find words. The 12 didn't speak either. They didn't need to. Their posture said everything, back straight, eyes forward, arms at their sides. Eli stood at the center. He wore the dress blues of a federal agency, sharp lines, silver badge, polished shoes. But it wasn't the uniform that caught Dan's eye. It was the way the young man held himself, solid, grounded. Not the boy who once curled up on a garage cot, bruises on his ribs and silence in his throat. No, this was a man who had faced fire and come through with purpose. Dan stepped forward. Eli gave a signal, and all 12 raised their hands in salute simultaneously, precisely with a reverence rarely seen outside memorials. Dan's breath caught. He'd seen salutes before. In war, at burials, at ceremonies soaked in formality and grief. But this was something else. Not about rank or duty. This was about respect, about love. He raised his own hand, slowly returning the gesture. His fingers touched his brow. The moment hung in the air like a cord that would never resolve. Then Eli stepped forward, lowering his hand. The others followed suit and held their position as he approached Dan. For a long second, they simply looked at each other. One man who had nothing but gave everything. One boy who had nothing and took only what was freely offered and built a life from it. "I kept my promise," Eli said softly. "I said I'd come back when I was ready." Dan nodded, voice low. "You did more than that." Eli smiled a little sheepishly. "They wanted to meet you. The ones I served with, the ones who came through rough patches like mine. They asked me how I got out, how I stayed alive." He glanced back at the line of uniforms. "I told them about the sandwiches, the cooler on the bench. The man who never asked me to explain just gave me room to breathe." Dan's jaw tightened as he swallowed emotion. "I thought maybe they'd come one or two at a time," Eli continued. "But when I told them you were getting married, they said they wanted to be there. All of them. For the man who gave me back my name." Dan blinked. "I never gave you anything more than lunch." Eli shook his head, his voice full now. "You gave me safety, dignity, a second chance, and you did it without needing thanks or recognition. That kind of quiet goodness, it echoes. You didn't just save me, Dan. You showed me how to save others." Behind them, the gathered guests, friends, kids, neighbors, and now even strangers had begun to crowd around. But still no one interrupted. Dan turned to the group. Some looked young, others seasoned, but all of them wore that same expression, a mix of respect and awe. Grace came forward, lacing her fingers through Dan's. "Would you—" Eli hesitated, then pulled something from his inside pocket. "Would you allow us to present you something?" Dan frowned slightly. "You don't have to." But Eli was already stepping aside, nodding toward one of the women in a navy uniform. She approached, holding a small case the size of a book. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a custom medallion mounted on velvet, engraved with the words, "In gratitude for service beyond uniform, where kindness starts, miracles follow." Dan stared. "We had it made," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not military, it's not official, but to us it means everything. Because you taught us something no briefing ever could." Dan looked up, his eyes glistening. "I don't know what to say." Grace leaned in, whispering, "You don't have to say anything. Just accept it." So he did. With hands that had rebuilt more engines than he could count, Dan reached forward and took the medallion. He held it close as though it might slip away. But it didn't. It was real, and so was this moment. That night, long after the guests had drifted away and the stars had come out in full force, Dan stood alone at the back of the garage. The old bench still sat beneath the elm tree, the red cooler perched on top, more symbol than utility now. Dan touched it gently. Eli stepped out from the shadows a moment later, no longer in uniform. Just jeans and a soft gray hoodie, the same kind of thing he used to wear. "I left one more thing," Eli said. Dan raised an eyebrow. "In the toolbox." Dan walked over, opened the top drawer. Inside was a key. "It's for the second garage," Eli said. "The one we're opening 2 counties over. They approved the blueprint last week. It's going to be called the Wrench Project." Dan looked up. Eli shrugged. "You told me once that teaching someone to fix something gave them more than a skill, it gave them power. I think it's time we handed more of that power out." Dan smiled. "I'd say we're just getting started," he said. And in that moment, surrounded by stars, tools, and echoes of the past, Dan realized something. Legacy isn't built in thunder. It's built in gestures, one wrench, one sandwich, one moment of compassion, repeated and shared. And standing next to Eli with Grace just inside the doorway, laughter from the younger kids echoing in the distance, Dan felt it deep in his bones. He wasn't just fixing broken things anymore. He was helping rebuild people, and that he thought was the finest engine he'd ever touched. The next morning, the town felt change, not in the way of headlines or parades, but in the quiet, reverent shift that follows something deeply human. The wedding, the salute, and the unexpected gift of the medallion had passed like a warm tide over everyone who had witnessed it. But Dan wasn't ready to leave the moment behind. Not yet. The garage opened late that morning. The sun had risen high by the time Dan arrived, coffee in hand, still in yesterday's dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Grace was already inside rearranging the community bulletin board near the entrance, humming something soft and sweet. "You're glowing," Dan said, walking in with a small grin. She gave him a mock glare. "I'm organizing flyers. Glowing is not part of the job description." He chuckled. "You make even duct tape look elegant." Grace waved him off but blushed. "Lucas and Mia are due in later. You should check the mail. There's a box on the counter from Eli." Dan's eyebrows rose. Already she nodded. It came by courier. No label, just a card on top that says, "Open alone." Dan picked it up plain, cardboard taped tight, nothing to give it away except a small folded note on top. He opened it. "For the man who gave without asking. This is the part you never saw but deserve to know." Eli inside, he found a bundle of manila folders, photos, and sealed envelopes, dozens of them. Organized, indexed, stamped with names, towns, and timelines. Dan sat down at the desk, pulled the first one close, and opened it. Inside, a photograph of a teenage boy in a hospital gown. Attached was a typed report, an account of a young runaway who had attempted suicide and survived after being pulled out of a drainage tunnel by someone named Elijah Carter. The doctors credited swift action and unusual intuition. The boy, now enrolled in community college, had listed Eli as his emergency contact. Dan frowned and opened the next. A girl named Trina from Cheyenne, once living in a car with her younger brother, who had been handed a gas card and 2 sleeping bags by a volunteer who never gave his name. Eli had written follow-ups, helped her get into a women's shelter, helped her brother find a foster family. The next folder, then another. Each one was a life. Each one had Eli somewhere in the margins, never the hero of the story, always the helper in the background, the thread that stitched the broken fabric together. But every thread traced back to the same place: Dan. In each summary, there was a line, a detail, a moment, a quote that made it unmistakable. Eli had modeled his actions after Dan's choices: his silence, his compassion, his refusal to demand explanation, his belief that giving something small could save something big. Dan sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. His vision blurred. He blinked hard, and then he reached the final envelope. It wasn't a folder, just a plain white envelope with his name printed in all caps. Inside was a photograph, grainy black and white, taken years ago. It showed Eli as a boy sitting on the bench outside the garage, holding a sandwich in both hands. His head was down. He looked scared, small and visible. Underneath the photo, in blue ink, Eli had written, "This was the day everything changed. I was starving, not just for food, for hope. You gave me both and never even asked my name." Dan pressed the photo to his chest. That afternoon, Dan gathered the kids after their projects. Lucas was finishing a brake replacement, and Mia had just cleaned out the carburetor on a dirt bike they'd been trying to restore. Grace brought lemonade. The garage doors were open, the air sweet with summer and engine oil. "I want to tell you something," Dan said, voice steady but low. They all looked up, attentive, even quiet Marisol. "You've all heard of Operation Wrench," he continued. "Some of you even know Eli helped start it." He looked down at the box beside him. "But what you don't know is that it's been changing lives far beyond this garage. And it all began not with a mission statement or a grand plan, but with a sandwich, a cooler, a bench outside those doors." Dan took a breath. "I didn't set out to save anybody. I just knew a kid needed food and a little bit of space to breathe. But Eli took that small act and multiplied it. Across counties, across lives." He paused, eyes misting. "I thought I was helping him, but the truth is, he's been helping me ever since." Grace stood beside him, one hand on his back. Then Lucas said, "So, everything we're part of now." "Eli's been watching." Dan nodded. "He's not just watching, he's building, just like all of you." There was a silence, and then Marisol asked the question Dan had expected. "Why didn't he ever tell you?" Dan smiled. "Because he wanted to be sure he wasn't just repeating the kindness, he wanted to earn it, in his own way." That night, Dan sat alone at the workbench, the final folder spread before him. He lit the old desk lamp, its glow casting long shadows on the photo wall nearby. He added a new frame. It held Eli's note, "For the man who gave without asking." Below it, Dan scribbled a reply on a scrap of paper and pinned it underneath. "You gave it all back without needing to." He leaned back, arms crossed, a quiet pride settling over him, like a well-worn jacket. The garage wasn't just a place of repair anymore. It was a compass, pointing every broken kid, every second-chance seeker, every soul teetering on the edge towards something steady, something that started with kindness and grew into legacy. The garage hummed with life, not the hurried clatter of business, but the rich, steady rhythm of something well-built and well-loved. The kind of sound a place makes when it becomes more than a building, when it becomes home. A week had passed since Dan had read Eli's box of stories since he'd held the photo of that boy on the bench, and realized fully and finally what a quiet act of kindness could become when multiplied through time, through people, through love. And now everything he did carried a new weight, but also a new lightness, a kind of joy that wasn't loud, but ever present, like sun through a workshop window. He stood at the main bay door that morning, coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other. Lucas was already at work on an old Dodge that needed its radiator flushed. Mia was helping a new kid, Jalen, who had just joined the program last week, figure out how to replace a tire. Grace crossed the shop in her usual purposeful stride, a folder tucked under her arm, and leaned against the workbench beside Dan. "They sent it," she said, holding out a letter with an embossed seal on the top. Dan took it carefully and read it aloud. "On behalf of the Wyoming State Education Board and the Governor's Office, we are pleased to recognize the Wrench Project at Foster's Garage as an official youth vocational development site. Approved for state funding and partnership effective immediately." Grace beamed. "It's done. We're certified. That means scholarships, resources, equipment, grants, the works." Dan stared at the letter like it might evaporate. "I'm just a mechanic." "No," she said. "You're the spark." He glanced out across the floor at the teenagers bent over engine bays and circuit boards at the tools, organized by loving hands at the photo wall that now spanned almost an entire panel full of Eli's stories. The wedding day, the 12 salutes, the first class of students. He took a breath. "Then let's make this thing bigger." 2 weeks later, they held the first official Wrench Project open day. The whole town came. It wasn't a grand affair. No red carpets, no podiums. Just what Dan always knew worked best: open garage doors, honest work, and full hearts. The local high school sent a bus of students. A principal gave a short speech. Marisol led a tour of the shop with all the enthusiasm of someone guiding a rocket launch. Lucas demonstrated how to rebuild a carburetor in under 6 minutes. Mia gave a talk titled, "Why Tools Shouldn't Be Intimidating and Neither Should People." Grace organized tables where parents and teens could sign up for apprenticeship paths, college credit courses, even summer camps, each one made possible by partnerships Eli had helped broker from behind the scenes. Near the end of the day, a young woman, maybe 19, maybe 20, approached Dan holding her younger brother's hand. "Mr. Foster," she asked, voice soft but clear. He turned, wiping grease from his hands. "That's me. I just wanted to say, thank you. You don't know us, but you helped someone who helped someone who helped us." She handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was a printout of a social worker's notes, tracking how a meal voucher from the Wrench Project had kept her and her brother in a shelter long enough to finish school. "Eli," Dan asked. She nodded. "He never told us your name, but I recognized you from the photo wall when I got here." Dan looked at the boy beside her, maybe 9 years old, wide eyes, holding a toy wrench someone must have handed him earlier. "Does he like fixing things?" Dan asked. The woman smiled. "He does now." Dan crouched beside the boy. "You ever want to learn how to fix an engine?" The boy nodded. Dan held out his hand. "Then come by any day you want. First lesson's always free." That night, long after the last guest had gone and the last folding chair had been put away, Dan stood alone beneath the elm tree behind the shop. The red cooler was still there. It hadn't been used in years, not since Eli had stopped needing it. But Dan had never moved it. He cleaned it, occasionally tightened the lid when storms rolled in. To most, it was just a plastic box. But to Dan, it was something sacred, a symbol of a beginning that didn't look like a beginning at the time. Just like so many acts of kindness so small, they nearly vanish when measured in the moment. But not in the heart. He opened the lid and found something he hadn't placed there. A note, folded, taped to the bottom with a small strip of blue painter's tape. His fingers shook slightly as he peeled it off and opened it. "You gave me food. You gave me silence. You gave me time. So I'm giving back what I can, 1,000 hands fixing 1,000 broken things, and the hope that none of them feel invisible again. Thank you, E. Dan closed the lid slowly and leaned back against the tree. The stars were beginning to rise. Behind him, the lights of the garage glowed, and somewhere he imagined across the country engines were being fixed. Lives were being changed. Kindness was moving. Not loudly, but steadily, just like it always had. As Grace came to join him, her hand slipping into his, Dan whispered something into the night. I thought I was saving one life. He turned to her, eyes damp but shining. But it turned out I was starting an engine, and that engine now would never stop. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below so we can see how far this story has reached. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt tales about kindness, healing, and the quiet miracles that change lives. Thank you so much for watching. Your time, presence, and support mean the world to us.